Good day, students, and welcome to Module 1, Special Needs and Inclusion. This is week 1 of this course, SPED 185, Introduction to Special Education, and Module 1 will run for 2 weeks. The learning objectives for this session are as follows. 1. We would want that by the end of this session, students would be able to differentiate between disability and handicap. 2. Explain the different perspectives of disabilities. 3. Value diversity in all students regardless of perceived ability. 4. Understand the history and nature of special education. And 5. List and explain the characteristics of inclusive environments. I'd like to begin by asking you to reflect on your own understanding of special needs. When you hear that term, what comes to mind? Do you think of someone who is different from you? Do you perceive your own self as having a special need? Well, it's interesting to note that the World Health Organization has said that disability is a part of the human condition. And so with this sobering understanding, it must be understood that at some point in life, whether it's going to be something permanent that occurs or something that happens temporarily, just as minor as maybe a cut on the finger that allows you not to be able to write for a short period of time. At some point in life, every person is going to experience some sort of disabling condition. So what has been your understanding? What has been your attitude? What has been your feeling towards disability? Let's see some myths and let's look at some facts. Are you aware of them? I've heard this one so many times in the classroom. The child who is not doing well in class is just lazy, obstinate, doesn't like to learn, pay attention, and follow directions. Is this a myth or is it a fact? Well, this is indeed a myth. You see, many children who are considered to be learning disabled, it's not necessarily because they are unable to learn anything at all, but it just means that that student learns in a different way. And so a student who one might consider to be lazy or not willing to learn, it just might be that the teaching approach that is being used is not the right one to meet the specific need of the child. What about this one? Is it a myth or is it a fact that any child who wears glasses is a child with special needs? This is indeed a fact, because the use of glasses or spectacles is really an aid. It's an aid in vision, and it is considered an accommodation for the special need of the visual impairment, whatever it is. Is this a myth or is it a fact? As a teacher, you must encourage your students never to stay and ask questions about disability. Well, this is a myth. The whole concept of disability should no longer be taboo. And so it's okay for students to ask questions once they are polite. People should ask questions, and then the disability becomes less mystical and less fearsome. Now that you've evaluated your own perceptions, I'd like to let you know that recognizing children's differences is a critical part of your role as an educator. When you get into the classroom, and I know that there are some in-service teachers who are listening to this lecture now who are in the program, as well as there might be some pre-service teachers, you must go in with the understanding that every child that would be placed in your charge would be different. They are going to have different likes, they're going to have different dislikes, they're going to have different strengths, they're going to have different weaknesses, as well as the very obvious that they will not all look the same and they would not all come with the same experiences. And so it's critical that as an educator, you learn to understand and appreciate diversity. Exceptionality refers to differences. And so the term special needs, the term disability, and the term exceptionality, the term differences, they are all synonymous. They each refer to a specific emotional, mental, physiological, psychological, or even a social condition that affects a child's development and learning. There are at least three perspectives as it relates to persons with disabilities and how it is viewed. There's the deficit perspective that says that a person with a disability is less than. Now, I'm sure that you're all aware of the concept of intelligence, and they use the intelligence quotient to measure a person's ability in terms of being able to think and comprehend, and we refer to that as your cognitive ability, right? It's often viewed on a curve that is referred to as the bell curve, and this is a normal distribution which relates to where persons' intelligences lie. And so persons can be of average intelligence, and that's where the bulk of the population is. And there are persons who have lower intelligence and higher intelligence. Those of lower intelligence are those that are considered to have disabilities, and they are perceived to be at a disadvantage. They are perceived to be less than those who have average or even higher intelligence. The cultural perspective says that depends on a specific society's values and beliefs. Then a person who has a disability, that can be seen as either a blessing or a curse. And there's also the sociological perspective that really says that a society's view of a disability is really a socially constructed phenomenon. It depends on how the persons in society relate to a person with a special need. That is how the society will view the person. And so these three perspectives help us to realize that perceptions do indeed matter. It really depends on how you as a person, and by extension, how other persons who come into contact with individuals with special needs, how they respond to them, that would impact the quality of life that that person would have and the level of normalization that would exist. The World Health Organization also makes a distinction between disability and handicap. When they're speaking about disability, obviously it's a difference, and it relates to some difference or a limitation in physical and cognitive activities. And we mentioned before that a disability is a regular part of the human condition. But a handicap, on the other hand, is a socially constructed term again. So it's some sort of limitation or barrier that is placed on an individual, regardless of perceived disability or even ability. There is no single accepted theory of normal development. And so, because of this, relatively few definite statements can be made about exceptional learners. In some societies, in some settings, expectations exist where a student who is about 4 or 5, before he or she enters primary school or elementary school, that child might be expected to be able to write and write legibly. Whereas in other settings, a student going into the primary school environment may not be expected to do that kind of task. And so because of this, there is reason for optimism, because it tells us then that through sensitization of special needs, of getting persons to understand and appreciate diversity, that there is hope for our education system. We also need to place an importance on abilities rather than a person's limitation. We have also looked at a disability versus a handicap, and with the understanding that a handicap is a barrier that is placed by society, then we can appreciate that a person's limitation or special need has nothing to do with their inability to participate, but it's really how society stops them from participating. And so, with that understanding, we realize that disability does not mean inability. As classroom teachers, it's important that you understand this so that you can ensure that your students, even those who have that label of disability or special needs, that those students receive quality care and education from you as the person who is in charge of helping them to maximize their potential. There are different categories of exceptionalities, and these are labels that have been defined internationally. There are 14 categories. IDEA, which is the American law for education, and we will look at that later on, defines 13 categories, with gifted and talented being the exception. However, here in the Caribbean, all 14 of these categories are recognized when we speak about special education service provision. We will look more at each different category of exceptionality in modules 2 and 3. So what then is the definition for special education? Special education is specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs and abilities of exceptional students. Yes, we've recognized before in our discussion that all learners have different special needs. And so a classroom teacher who is able to provide instruction to meet the needs of the child is providing, in essence, special education. More specifically, when it is a disability label exists, as with the labels that we have just seen on this slide, then when that label exists and the educator is designing instruction to meet the needs based on strengths and weaknesses and other opportunities to excel or to be successful, then that is the provision of special education. It takes different forms. It can be as simple as providing specialized materials. It can be with the use of specialized teaching techniques. Special education can also involve high-tech equipment or specialized facilities. And it can also involve related services such as medical services or therapy, whatever the need may be. There have been 4 periods in the development of special education services as is provided today. In the very early years, persons with disabilities were excluded from the school environment, and as time progressed, they were allowed to enter the school system, and up to now, it has come to the point where educational equality and equal educational services are provided, and this is known as inclusion. Inclusion relates to the whole philosophy of normalization as well, which looks at a person with a disability being a functional member of society and being fully integrated. There were many different pioneers in special education: Itard, Seguin, Gallaudet, and they have really advocated for special ed to get to where it is today. I'd like for us to recognize the difference between mainstreaming and inclusion. As the definitions say, mainstreaming has to do just with a placement in the general ed setting, but it suggests that the student must earn their right to be there. However, inclusion says that it is the right of the student to be there and that accommodations and modifications should be given so that the child would be able to function optimally in the inclusive environment. Inclusive classrooms must have high expectations, high levels of communication, student engagement, and it must be stimulating. This is where I leave you. I encourage you to read the notes and get involved in the discussion.